can be helpful. And then talking to your team about having a training. There are a number of national organizations that offer free training on ERPO, and you can reach out, and I'm happy to help connect you with those training resources as well. And with that, I have my contact information here, and I'm happy to take questions. And if there are follow-ups after the fact, please reach out. And I'm very happy to help support this work in your team.
Well, thank you, Chelsea Parsons. Wonderful presentation. So much information in such a small amount of time.
It is a lot of information. I know it's a lot to take in. I really do encourage folks, if you are working in one of the 22 states that has an extremist protection order law, and you're interested in having, I do a lot of lunch and learn kind of presentations where we could do something that is more tailored to the law in your state. I'm very happy to do that anytime. So if you're interested in learning more and really digging in on how this works in your state, please feel free to reach out.
So Chelsea's contact information, the session presentation, her slide deck, and this Q&A will all be in the post-conference email packet that you receive day or day from now. And that will also have your survey for your continuing education. So you really do want to take a look at that. Chelsea, I'm a big fan, but I know there's going to be questions from people in our attendees. If they can please put those questions in the Q&A, we'll try to drag you into the conversation and get you to ask Chelsea your question directly. That always makes it more interesting to us all. But I have so many questions right off the bat. We'll get started. I want to talk about implementation and mobile crisis specifically, what you've seen happen around the country, what your ambitions are, how do you see this working out? And then I want to talk a little bit about what we've done, you and I have done here in Portland
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I
to
think
work
the thing,
to
oh,
work
sorry, go
with
ahead.
and to work with law enforcement. This is a place where mobile crisis really does need to work with law enforcement and where it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing to remember and to emphasize is that these laws are relatively new in almost every state where they've been enacted. So the majority of them have been enacted only since 2018. And up until a couple of years ago, there really hasn't been a huge push on implementation of these laws. And so I would not be surprised if many people who are in attendance today who work in those states have never heard of this. And that's very common. It takes a lot after the bill signing and kind of the ceremony around something like this to actually really get the meat and potatoes of what it takes for a law like this to be very useful in the community. And so, it takes a lot of work. Again, I would really encourage folks, if you're in one of those states, just to learn more about what the law does in your state and kind of how it works. A good example of a jurisdiction that has incorporated ERPO into a crisis response is in Seattle. The Seattle Police Department has a crisis response unit. I don't know if any of those folks are here today. I would love to have them kind of speak up and share some of their experience. But that is a police department that has really done a lot to promote training around extremist protection orders and to really incorporate that tool as one of many that can be considered in different cases when you're responding to somebody in crisis, where the access to firearms is one of the kind of most urgent needs in the moment. So,
It,
so Seattle has been doing that for a couple of years now, really successfully.
it is the nightmare scenario in mobile crisis is that you're working with a person who is dangerous, who really needs your help, who doesn't need the help of the police, but there's just this one thing in between you and really be and that's safety. And that safety can be resolved with removing the gun or other sorts of weapons. This covers other sorts of weapons as well, right?
It depends on the state. I see that question in the chat. It depends on how the state law is written. Some states, it is specific to firearms and ammunition. Some states, it is a little more broad to include other kinds of weapons. So it just depends on how the law is written in that state.
Boy, I don't know about your community, but every time I read someone running around with a samurai sword,
Yeah.
I think ERPO.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the kind of behaviors that would inform the decision whether or not to file an ERPO petition and take that concern to the court.
And so you have seen some programs around the country pick up this idea and start to work on it. Seattle, you're explaining. What would be the first steps you would say for, say, someone like our prior speakers, Clay Robbins, Beethoven, and Steve Michiork? They're running programs in New York and in Oregon. What would be the first steps that they would take in bringing this to their team?
I think the first step would be to learn a little bit more on your own about the law and kind of what it does. And there are a lot of resources that are available to do that. We have some at Everytown. There's actually a really great resource. There's a national ERPO resource center that's funded by the federal government. If you go to erpo.org, there's resources and information about every state. So spend half an hour just reading what you can about the law. And then I think I would go to the leadership of the team and just ask the question, what do we know about this? Have any of you ever worked on a case where, this law was invoked? Does anybody like what do we know? Do our partners in the police department use this? Like, just start to learn a little bit more about how this law is being used or not being used in your community. And then from there, I think reaching out to myself or to one of our other national partners to ask for a training where you could bring together all of the kind of key decision makers in the program to have that first conversation about this is what the law is in the state and talk through some of those details about how it could potentially be a useful tool to the response team in appropriate cases.
And when we're talking about it being a tool that the mobile crisis program uses, you're not necessarily saying that the program itself would execute one of these
Correct.
judicial orders. They would not be filling out the paperwork, carrying it to the judge, etc.
Correct. In most states, that's going to be the case. In most states, mobile crisis workers, unless they're sworn law enforcement, would not be eligible to be a petitioner. So I think, and in the states, maybe where you're a medical provider that meets the requirements for somebody to file a petition, it still might not be the right path forward. I think what I would hope is that crisis responders know enough about ERPO to be able to either talk to their partners in law enforcement about seeking a petition or seeking an order in a case where there really is an urgent and imminent risk of firearms violence, and or working with that person's support system, family members, household members, about whether or not it would be the right decision for them to proceed in going to court and filing an order. And I think that is how the crisis response community, I think, can have the biggest impact in terms of making sure that ERPO is being considered in cases of the highest risk of firearm violence.
Let's walk through exactly what's going to happen here. The mobile crisis worker is going to have this experience where they visit someone in their home, someone waves a gun around, the mobile crisis team exits, they know they may be called back. There's a gun, there's been a threat. What's the next step?
In that scenario, I think the next step would be reaching out to partners in law enforcement. If you have somebody, you have an urgent moment, you have the threat that's happening right now, that to me is a call to law enforcement so that they can assess the situation and determine if they should go to court immediately to get that temporary emergency order.
And should you call 911 or should you have someone you know?
Ideally, you have someone you know. So ideally, and this goes back to kind of what are some of the first steps that you would want to do if you
Mhm.
wanted to bring this to your team. Ideally, you would have a point of contact in your local law enforcement agency, who
Hmm.
is your ERPO point of contact, who
Hmm.
maybe that's in, if they have a behavioral health unit, that's sometimes where those folks are housed. Sometimes the folks who run domestic violence units or special victims units are the ones who have the ERPO expertise. So ideally, you would have a point of contact in the police department that you could reach out to directly with a case like this. If you don't have that, then, if 911 is your option, then that's your option. If that is, if you feel like the risk is that high. But again, this, to the extent that we can be working, prior to these kinds of crisis calls, finding that point of contact in advance, I think is really useful.
So optimal though is that you've had this conversation with your program, so the team all knows and they have some understanding about the rules here. But you've also had this conversation with Officer Friendly and said we might have a situation where we would call you and this is this we want you to, and so they should also know about ERPO and that you do this sort of work, you the mobile team.
Yeah, absolutely. And another key relationship to have would be with the court. So whichever the
Ah.
right local court is. And in a number of jurisdictions, there are judges who have really taken it upon themselves to create a local protocol. I was recently in touch with a judge in Lansing, Michigan, and she, when the law went into effect a couple years ago, said, okay, we need a standardized protocol. We need to have, instructions and forms, and she has organized trainings for law enforcement in the community about the law. And so also having conversations in advance with the relevant court personnel so that what they are going to be looking for in these cases in advance, I think is also really helpful.
So when you call your officer friendly, they're not just going to go out to this person's house and take the gun away. There's something else that has to happen. There's this paperwork that needs to be done. Who does the paperwork?
So it's going to be if we're bringing in law enforcement to kind of assess the situation, it'll be the officer who will be doing the paperwork. What they may ask from the crisis responder is a statement, an affidavit, spelling out what you observed and kind of the reason for the concern. And that might be part of the supporting materials that go to the court.
Okay, so the officer can fill out the paperwork. So the mobile crisis team program is not on the paperwork per se, and the family member is not on the paperwork. The police officer is on the paperwork, and then they take it to the judge.
Correct.
And what's this ex parte hearing look like?
So it can take a couple of forms. It can, if it's after hours, it can be a phone call with the judge where the officer is presenting all the information. It often looks a lot like a search warrant application for folks who are familiar with that process. So it's intended to be a process where you can get to a judge quickly. They can review the evidence that you're providing to them and then make a decision, you know, quickly about whether or not to issue this order. So if the judge decides that there is enough evidence to warrant or to justify issuing this temporary order, then it'll be granted, and then the officer will go serve that order on the individual, and at that point we'll say, the court has issued this order and explain what it means. What it means is that as of right now, you're not allowed to have firearms. So, it's in everybody's interests. If you turn over to me any firearms you already have, you're going to get them back. This is a temporary situation. On this piece of paper, it tells you what day to go to court. You go to court on this day, and you can explain to the judge why you're not a risk and why you should have your guns back. And the officers who do this regularly are very skilled at it and having these conversations in a way that is intended to de-escalate and is intended to mitigate the risk. And so that's how that emergency process generally goes.
Let me back up. I'm sorry. I just want to get this really detailed. Back up just a little bit. We want to protect the Second Amendment, of course. So, right at the gate, the law officer the officer has some evidence provided by the mobile team. They've made out some paperwork. They call the judge. If it's the samurai sword, it's urgent. If it's the gun that's been under the bed for months, that's maybe tomorrow. The judge says, "Show me the evidence," and then the judge has to make a decision,
Correct.
and the
And
judge
those
might say
temper
no.
they might say no. They very much might say no. And that's one of the things when we're looking at the data about these laws from state to state, we look at how many petitions are denied, and a healthy number of petitions are denied every year in every state. Judges, that's their job. Their job is to review the evidence. The statutes are very clear about what standard of proof needs to be there in order to be granted. And so the judges take that really seriously. And one thing that can happen at that emergency stage is the judge can say, I don't see enough here right now to issue an order without a full hearing, without the person coming in front of me. So I'm going to deny your temporary order request, but I'll set a hearing date on your final order request. So come back in
Hmm.
2 weeks and we can, kind of talk it through. And I want to see evidence from both sides. And so that's
So,
another option that the judges have.
so the mobile team could add to the evidence if the first iteration isn't successful, they can add to. So there's
Correct.
another safeguard is that the law officer may look at the evidence presented by the mobile team and say, "I'm not bringing this to the judge. You don't have a case here."
Correct.
Is that something that the law officer can say no?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm. So that's an additional safeguard, and that's not some somewhat objective person, probably a fan of the Second Amendment. Most officers are. They're not going to bring this forward unless they believe it's a worthy case.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, o- officers who respond to crisis calls themselves um, recognize the value of having an ERPO. They don't always have enough to arrest somebody. It's not always the case that a person who is making threats is engaging in behavior that rises to the level of a crime or where there's probable cause for a crime. But there are certainly cases where officers don't feel good about leaving the scene without having done something to intervene. And so yes, they treat, I mean, there's always exceptions, but by and large, they treat these very seriously. And again, they're not going to want to go to court and get yelled at by a judge that they're bringing a frivolous case. The other thing I will say, speaking of frivolous cases, is that most of these laws have provisions in them that actually make it a crime to file a frivolous ERPO petition.
Mm.
So a lot of times during the political debates about these laws during the legislative process, a
Hmm.
concern is raised that this will be used to harass people. It'll be used in some kind of malicious way. And so most
Hmm.
of the statutes have it written in that if you are lying in a petition, if you're using this process in a malicious way, you can be charged criminally for that.
An unserious question. In the states that don't have that provision, do you see abuse of this law?
No, we see extremely little abuse of this law.
So the mischief managed.
Yeah.
Okay, so the judge has this order, has issued the order, hands it back to the law officer. Does that law officer then go out to this person's home and what do they do?
Yes. So at that point, they then need to serve that order in the same way that protective order needs to be served, other kinds of court orders need to be served. Um, Often, what they will do is what they should do is assess the safest way to make service, right? So if this is a case where the officer has already been on the scene, has had contact with maybe the household members who called in the concern, they'll check back in with those folks to say, okay, I have this order, how can we approach the individual in a way that's going to be productive, that's not going to escalate. Like, how do we do this safely? And so they'll do a safety plan and they will kind of do an assessment. And sometimes what they'll do is decide they're going to wait until the person comes out of their house the next morning, maybe to go get in their car to go to work, and approach them then, as opposed to knocking on the door where you maybe don't know what you're going to find behind the door. And so they'll do that kind of safety planning and that assessment to figure out the safest way to serve this order and to kind of seek the relinquishment of the firearms. Um, that'll be safe for officers, that'll be safe for other people in the home, and that'll be safe for the individual.
Yeah, I think any officer will tell you that a doorway is about the most dangerous place on the planet Earth. to try to force something. It's a good strategy. And are you finding that these officers are getting into trouble? I know in the mobile crisis world, we do want to kind of limit police officer engagement with people in crisis.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to remember also that from the perspective of a mobile crisis provider, it may be the case that when you're there, you know you don't want to involve law enforcement for
Hmm.
all of the very valid reasons that might be the case. And that'll be a situation where you'll want to talk to a family member and say, here's this option for you. We don't have to call the police right now. If the court issues an order, law enforcement will probably serve it because that's the safest thing to do. But if we want to start this process, we can go, you can go to court yourself. Here are the forms. Here's kind of how you do it. Um, so that is the intent of this law is to provide a non-law enforcement approach here, like a non-criminal legal system approach.
Hmm.
Um, and so the reality is that because we're talking about firearms, law enforcement at some point is going to have to get involved if the person already possesses firearms and they need to be relinquished. That is, you don't want to have family members trying to take somebody's guns away from them. So it's a delicate balance. I think there are examples of law enforcement agencies around the country who do it extremely well, who have really good protocol in place. They have a lot of good examples of kind of how they approach these cases. And like I said, these laws are new, and so we're kind of learning more every year about really the best practices and how to make this tool really effective.
Well, I think we have some of the best practices now, at least starting here in Portland, Oregon. And I want to talk about what you did here, what we got started here, and how's it going? How did this get started? We started talking about ERPO a few 6 months ago.
Yeah, well, and don't give me that much credit here. I think this was a homegrown effort, led by you and by the city council member. But the Secretary of State in Oregon, I think a year or so ago, issued a report that offered an audit of the use of ERPO across the state in Oregon. And Oregon is a state that's had the law in the books for a couple of years. I think they enacted it in 2018, so it's been around for a while. And included in this report was a chart that showed ERPO filings by county.
Hmm.
And what this chart showed was that Multnomah County, which is where Portland is located and which is the largest city in the state, was among the bottom of the pack when it came to use of ERPO across the state of Oregon. And so I think that was a surprise to folks in the community and to the city council, um, and led to some inquiries of the police bureau about like why aren't we using this law more? And so those inquiries, and I think because they were being led by a particular city council member who I think is the chair of the public safety committee. Put pressure on the police department to do more when it came to being prepared to file ERPO petitions. And so what the police bureau has done is identified that point of contact in the department that we talked about before, who is the ERPO expert in the department. It is someone who's part of the behavioral health threat assessment team, I think is what the
Something like
vaccine
that. That's
is.
our co-responder team here in Portland.
And so what he's done is a lot of training internally in the department to make sure that across all kinds of specialties, everybody knows what this is, and training and outreach to the community to start increasing awareness in the community that this is something you can ask for. And this is something you can reach out to the police department about. And then we did a couple of community hearings back in October talking about these issues and bringing in an expert from a neighboring county where they have been using ERPO quite a bit more. And so I think we're starting to see use increase in Portland. And I think it shows the impact of just attention and having all of the relevant kind of stakeholders with power in the community being aware of this and kind of putting pressure on the police department to make sure that they are prepared and equipped to be using this in appropriate cases.
There was so much hullabaloo in 2018 when this law was passed here, and I imagine in Michigan last year when it was passed there, that huzzah, we've solved this problem, and then silence, nothing.
Yeah.
What's the disconnect?
I think the disconnect is that it's, I don't want to say it's easy to pass a law, but it's relatively easy to pass a law in that, you know, once you do your
You
persuasion,
fought the
right?
whole gun lobby down.
But once they do their signing and everybody says we did it,
Yeah.
for a law like this, that is only the beginning of the work. These laws don't implement themselves. They most of the time they're not enacted with $1 million appropriation to support training and education. They're not enacted with any expectation around implementation. And so up until maybe 2 years ago, it's really been just kind of left to each local jurisdiction to figure out how to use this law and whether they want to use it and what does that look like. And we now have more best practices from around the country that we can port to other places. But the reason it doesn't get used that much necessarily in some places is because people don't know about it and because it takes more work. You have to do something new now in order to make this law effective. And so moving bureaucracies to do new things when they are not being given more funding to do those things is extremely challenging.
I was remembering that this is a bill that there a law that's a lot like a stalking order. And it wasn't the police and it wasn't the courts and it wasn't the city council that got stalking orders to be used. It was women's rights organizations and anti-rape groups and public health officials that they over years and years and now it's common practice. We all know
Yeah.
about stalking orders and we all know the lives that they've saved.
Yeah. And it took 30, 40 years. And it's fun because I actually use not just stalking orders, but all of the domestic violence related restraining orders and there's a really strong infrastructure that supports survivors who are seeking assistance from those orders, and there's legal assistance, and there's all. When I was in law school, I did a clinic where I went and did pro bono work to support people who are seeking protection orders, and we don't have any of that yet for ERPO. And so we're kind of, I hold that up as an example while recognizing that that took, decades to get to the place where it is now.
So you at Everytown for Gun Safety are putting together these state by state coalition. You're getting to know people who are the advocates on the ground who can make this go.
Yes, absolutely. And we have part of our work at Everytown, we have a coalition of mayors who kind of, sign on to support gun safety. So we work with the mayors in our coalition to I'm actually going to Lansing, Michigan, the end of next week. If anybody's here from Lansing, reach out because we have an ERPO convening a half day that we're doing in Lansing in partnership with the mayor's office next week. It's we're ready to go. I mentioned that there's that National ERPO Resource Center, ERPO.org. That is run by the folks at Johns Hopkins University. They are available and doing the same thing, kind of trying to do as much outreach and training and support as possible. So we have more resources available now to support this work than we've had in the past. And at the same time, it's the implementation of it is really a locally driven endeavor.
So speak for a moment about the differentiation between what Everytown for Gun Safety, your organization,
Mhm.
does and what this Johns Hopkins does.
We are all friends and we all kind of offer the same thing. So what I would say is if you're interested in more and you don't know who to go to, reach out to me and I can help triage whether Everytown is the best, organization to help, whether Johns Hopkins is the best organization. The folks at Johns Hopkins do a lot of in-person trainings and convenings and seminars on ERPO. So if you're looking for somebody to travel, they're able to do that. They also do a lot of work really focused on clinical providers and healthcare workers and clinicians and kind of urging them to not just in the crisis, mobile crisis response context, but kind of more broadly. And so if you're particularly interested in that kind of aspect of the work from the perspective of a clinician, the folks at Johns Hopkins are very well situated to do that.
And today, if someone attending this conference is interested in bringing this idea to their program, can you be available to help?
Yeah, absolutely. Send me an email and we'll talk and we'll figure out kind of what the right next steps are.
And there might be, every program's going to be different. They might just be sniffing around. They might be ready to go. They might have a city council person in their pocket.
I love all of it.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your advocacy. Thanks for helping Portland out.
Of course, it's my pleasure.